I suggest if there are questions that people want to raise, points you want to raise at this point, that would be great. I'll hand all the most difficult ones over to my colleagues. But yeah, go for it.
Thank you very much. Just a question about the parish's role in relating to this review. It seems, looking at the pictures, that it's all going very much through the deanery. And so how is the parish understood apart from the deanery?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think I'll try and answer that, but Paul, chip in if the idea is that the Archdeacon would, there'd be a preparatory meeting to this with the mission enabler, but the Archdeacon would be spending a fortnight of his or her time every 2 years in each of the deaneries. But that wouldn't be meeting all the deanery together. That would be spending the vast majority of the time with individual parishes, really listening to and developing, and same with the mission enablers before that, their own parish development plans. And then the deanery bit will come in towards the end of that fortnight, where the deanery would come together. And actually that's where things like synergies, if your parish is trying to start Messy Church and there's another parish, 3 miles down the road that has already sort of got the bruises, learnt the lessons, trying to actually work out what are the synergies here. Or if you have something we're really wanting to encourage, if you have a full-time paid youth worker, you're blessed to do that, then, could a percentage, a tithe of that person's time be given to actually promoting or developing children's or youth work in another parish in the place? So I've always sort of held to the fact the parish is the basic unit here, because this is the community, this is the local community which meets together around the Lord's table, meets together under the preaching of God's word, and that is the basic community. But then the deanery is useful in then saying, well, actually, are there ways in which we can resource and help each other across the parishes so that the parish boundaries don't become sort of walls, but are sort of, we can actually cross-fertilise in a way that we need to be doing more and more, I think. So I hope that's a help. Yeah. Other questions? Great. We've even got a hill here for the Archdeacon, future Archdeacon of Cornwall to climb, so it's very, very appropriate. Mind you, we have plenty of hills.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for the presentation. Our two questions are totally unrelated.
Very good.
I was concerned with young people and youth, and the only reference I found on your presentation was the closure of school chaplains. I think that's tragic. I was brought into church work through attending diocesan summer house parties. Guildford Diocese closed that probably 20 years ago. I then moved to the YMCA in Guildford, who ran house parties. They closed it about 8 years ago, 10 years ago. Quite understand that it was for budgetary purposes. They are expensive. But I think we are all concerned, particularly those of us who come from small parishes. We're all getting older, and in small parishes we find it difficult to attract young people. The house party, or something residential, or even a day party, I think is key to coming into the church. I was very interested in the new magazine that's just come out, that you list festivals. Not a single one is in our patch. I think the best investment we could make is to restore something like a diocesan house party. We want to come to our own doorstep. We don't want to go to the Lake District or Cornwall.
Thank you very much. Some of us do want to go to the Lake District and Cornwall as well. But no, the point is well made. We actually have had very, very few parish share paid for chaplaincies. We've had a very part-time one at Guildford College for the last year or two, and I think, have we had one other?
Yes, at the Priory in Guildford.
I don't think that the Priory chaplain is okay. Oh, there's one that a number of churches in Woking have supported, but that's been outside of. So this isn't actually a massive change. Obviously, a lot of the private schools have chaplains. Some schools have a chaplain. Some church schools have a chaplain who are paid for out of school budget. It's simply saying that in the one or two cases where we have for historic reasons really, put some investment in an institution. We're not going to be doing that anymore. Now, I'm absolutely committed to house parties, to children's camps, young people's camps, and so on. In fact, that seems to be precisely an area where signposting is the key thing. Scripture Union run them, Church Pastoral Aid Society runs them. There are great big events like Green Belt and Walsingham and Soul Survivor and New Wine and all the rest. And actually, these aspects are absolutely fitted for developing people's faith in that way. So I don't think we need to think we must do this out of parish share funded people at the centre. I think in a way these are national resources with masses of experience which we really need to buy into. That would be my response to that. But I absolutely agree with your passion for the need for children and young people to be growing in faith and leadership too.
So just a really practical question, really. When can we expect to start seeing the Archdeacon's visitations? And as someone who's starting off the vision process in her parish kind of nowish, should I wait?
Very good. Now I will hand on to Paul at that point, because that's a good question.
I'd never wait for an archdeacon in particular. I think two answers to that question, Jen. The first is that realistically it's going to take us about 2 years to get every parish off the ground. It's like one of those songs that we sing in rounds that we're all going to have to start at different places. But once we're all started, it will then be a continuous journey. I think so realistically it's just that we're not going to be able to start everybody at once. That's not to say that in individual cases where you want to start a process, we can do that independently, and then when it comes round to the Archdeacon's visitation, you fit in like everybody else wherever you are in the cycle. So it's definitely not a message of put anything on hold until the Archdeacon can get round to seeing you. The Archdeacon will come and see you at whatever stage to give you whatever help they can.
And remember the reactive point as well. The mission team. Yes, you got him on your left-hand side, but you can invite Danny or members of the team to come and help with that at any stage.
I was just wondering, with the loss of the diocesan newspaper, first of all, and now the loss of the diocesan magazine, how is the person in the pew going to retain that sense of belonging to a diocese? I can imagine that the people who are involved, clergy or ministry teams who are involved, they might feel part of the diocese, but I'm a little concerned about the person in the pew. That's the first point. And the second one is that I noticed that the Director of Communications wouldn't be part of the Bishop's leadership team. And that seems to be, to me, perhaps a loss.
Okay, thank you very much. These are two very, very sensible questions to ask. I think there is a major question about written communication and websites and sort of what's needed in that whole area. And certainly the experience of the newspaper before, some churches used it quite well. An awful lot of churches weren't really. The travelling round parishes, one just got very tired of seeing large piles of diocesan newspapers just gathering dust in a corner and making the place shabbier rather than communicating. Now, in a way, we tried to break through with that by having a much a sort of classier production in a way in which we put a lot of time and energy, and I think people have really appreciated that. I still see piles of them gathering dust in churches, which is discouraging because we're putting a lot of resource into them. But I think that is a really good question, and I think we then need to think, well, actually, how do we sort of feed in that sense of being part of a bigger thing? In other ways. And I think particularly something like developing, the Archdeacon's visitations, the parish needs-based thing, actually having much more of a sense of actually working together from the centre, if we call it that, church house, whatever, and the parishes, actually will hopefully develop more of that kind of sense of partnership, which will go with that. On the bishop's leadership team point, I mean, Peter, do you want to just speak to that on whether the head of comms should be part of that team or not?
I mean, it's a good question. We actually, one of the things we're wanting to do as we build the new leadership in Church House is to look at that a little bit more broadly than perhaps we have. Yes, there will be a senior team who are there to prioritise and make kind of decisions and etc. But actually, we want to raise up within the staff in Church House, if you like, another level of leadership. We actually have some extremely capable people who are leading in quite key areas across our diocese at the moment from Church House, and we don't necessarily recognise them as leaders. And we see the head of communications, as there'll be, as one of those, if you like, second tier of leadership. Doesn't mean to say that that person therefore won't be engaged, that they won't be engaged in some of those conversations. We have for instance, we gather as a bishop's leadership team now on a Monday morning at 8:45 for 30 minutes, just to kind of give the highlights of what the things are that are coming up in the week ahead and to pray into those. The head of communications will be part of that type of gathering, because it's a great time to be able to engage about what's going on and keep connected. So I don't think just because they're not always sat round the table of those bishops' leadership teams meetings is to say they won't be engaged. We absolutely want to work proactively to engage more in the overall leadership in Church House.
Good.
It's a sort of follow-up to the previous answer. I think parishes have a role to play in diocesan communications. It not just as a repository for the magazine or the newspaper, but in their own communications vehicles, whether it's website or magazine, promoting in appropriate ways what the diocese is doing.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. And the other thing, of course, is parishes. This is where the action's at, and something we've been, I think, quite poor at. Certainly since I've been here, and I think before that as well, is actually collecting stories from parishes, which can then operate as inspiring stories for others to hear. Not inspiring because they're all singing, all dancing. Sometimes inspiring because people have slogged on through challenging things and really seen some development. We would love to see communications which is sort of drawing on parishes, particularly through video material and so on, so we can kind of share good practice. Where we have done that, it's been hugely appreciated. But thank you. I think that's a really good point.
Thank you very much. I have a question which, in a sense, isn't related to this, in that this is presented for parishes to understand their relationship to Church House and Church House's relationship to parishes. But I want to ask a question which focuses on one tiny part of a slide, and that was that the World Church Advisor will move to a voluntary post. I happen to have found the advice of Andy Wheeler very helpful, and in a broader context, we're living at a time when there's a certain unhealthy nationalism arising, not just in this country, but across the world. So I just wonder if moving to a voluntary post is a promotion or demotion of world mission.
Thank you very much. That's a really good point. And actually, there are a number of the roles, when you looked at them, where if you simply think, does this mean that that area is no longer important, it's going to be a real problem for us. If we're saying that spiritual development is no longer important or world mission is no longer important, then we're in big trouble. I think the thing that we've had to ask through this review, that there's actually, I can guarantee this, there's been no one working at Church House Guildford doing doing a bad job. There's no one been working there doing a job that has been easy to think, well, we can just sort of strike that off the list. You know, that's a straightforward one. Actually, people have been doing a good job. And when it comes to looking at a number of those areas that we've had to really make some quite hard decisions about, and these have been the things that have kind of kept us awake at night, as you can imagine, some hard decisions about, we've had to actually ask the question, is this way of doing it the best way, the most fruitful way of doing it? I'll give you an example. The environment. I think we all agree the environment is a very major issue. Globally, it's probably the most major issue facing our planet. Those churches that are involved in the environmental issues, both are discovering that is a really important way of engaging in the mission of God. The fifth mark of mission is about care for God's world. And also a good way of reaching out to younger generations for whom the environment is a real area of passion for them. Now the question is, do we therefore say we should have someone paid in Church House Guildford who is heading up the environment? It's a little bit like in a parish, you know. Do you say because this area is important, we need to have a paid member of staff to do that area? Or do you say, well, actually, we can't have paid members of staff to do everything. We really can't. It just gets far too expensive. So you then have to ask the question, well, what are the best ways of doing things? Where do we need paid members of staff to head things up? And where can we actually rely on volunteer bodies? And the environment's a really interesting case. I know it's very hard work for those who are involved with it, but that is done by volunteers, by a fantastic group of people. Leslie Crawley heads up, but who are really working in that area and actually have made a real impact in that area in the diocese. So something like World Mission, there are already quite a number of people within the diocese who are passionate about World Mission. And actually I've been gathering them, and particularly in our diocesan links, we have long-standing links with Nigeria, we have links with Denmark, we have a growing link with Pakistan, and actually there are little groups already who are working so that and can be developed further, so that when a team comes over from Denmark, or when we have the Lambeth Conference coming up next year and masses of bishops coming from all around the Anglican Communion, we actually have real enthusiasts on the ground who can do that stuff. And I think it is a different way of doing things, but I don't think it'll be a less effective way of doing things. So I think it's just sort of thinking, yeah, not saying because this is important, we need to have someone at Church House who kind of takes the lead on it. That's often the way dioceses have done things in the past. They thought we need someone who could go on that conference or can do that sort of thing. But actually that isn't always the most effective way of doing things. What I think your question rightly flags up is just making sure that where we are moving away from some of those areas, we do have other plans in place. We're not just saying, we're going to ignore that area. And that's very much in development at the moment in a number of those different areas.
Thank you very much, Bishop Andrew. Mission Enablers seems to be quite a significant or important part in this plan, and I just wondered if you could provide a little bit more detail about who you envisage they are. Are they existing members of Church House Guildford? Are they clergy, lay people who exist within the diocese? Are we going to clone Danny Wignall? Who are they? Because Paul... He's there. Paul mentioned about sort of broadening people's skill base, and I just wondered if you could, because it strikes me that they're quite central to the parish needs sort of response.
They are central, absolutely. I can hand over to Paul for part of this. I think we're not saying we need a large team of people whose only specialism is to go into parishes and listen and advise and so on. We recognise that we need specialisms in specific areas. We've heard about children and youth, really the importance of family ministry and so on. But actually broadening out some of those roles to actually say, well, people who have that experience, who have a wider experience of leadership within the church, whether in a lay capacity or an ordained capacity, could well be really effective in actually sitting down with a parish and doing the kind of exercise that Paul's been talking about. And Paul, do you want to just fill in on that a little bit more?
Absolutely. I think we already have mission enablers, and those mission enablers have particular specialisms, the sort of metaphor that comes to mind is that of the consultant. So we have consultants in specialist areas. What we're aiming to do is to sort of release them to do more general practice stuff as well, which is about a more broader kind of leadership alongside the specialism that they have. It may be, for example, that if one of the mission enablers is working with a parish that is wanting particularly to develop children and young people, then if that isn't a specialism of that particular mission enabler, they might speak to a mission enabler who has a specialism in that and draw their help in. Yeah.
Good. Questions coming thick and fast. It's very encouraging. Yeah. Being passed from. Well done.
You were talking about, is this the best way to do things? Just wondering, did you consult with other dioceses to see what they're doing to save a complete reinvention of the wheel and get some best practice from others?
Thank you. Yes, we have done quite a lot of discussion with other dioceses. Peter will come on to a bit of that in terms of sort of benchmarking the financial side. Quite a number of dioceses have gone down the track of saying, of bringing in mission and ministry. They've recognised that actually it's extraordinarily difficult to draw lines between them. So, for example, in our previous team, discipleship, vocation and ministry. Now, if we're saying that discipleship, making prayerful, confident disciples in daily life, is at the heart of everything that we're doing, then having just one team, which is called discipleship, vocation and ministry, doesn't make a whole lot of sense when the community engagement team can quite rightly say, well, actually, we're wanting people to be disciples in terms of their engagement with the community round about, and parish development and evangelism say, well, how can we develop parishes if we're not talking about discipleship? So that is a fairly tried and tested path. We're not sort of reinventing the wheel in that one. I think it is true to say that what we're seeking to do with these sort of new look archdeacons visitations, with mission enablers working alongside that, with having in a way a slightly more systematic approach, rather than just waiting until the phone rings and a parish says, help, we need. I don't think any other diocese has done that. So it is a little bit scary. It's a bit untried and untested. I'm quite excited about it. I think not least, I had a really good, some of you were there, but I went and joined a 24-hour residential of clergy from one of the deaneries. And actually they were very honest with me, and it was a good honesty, it was good, robust conversation. Sort of saying things like, look, I am working hard in my parish, these things are happening, developing, but I just don't think that anyone really sort of at the centre, they kind of know what's going on. And of course, it's not as though archdeacons and bishops, we do get out and about around the parishes quite a lot, but that more sort of systematic approach of actually listening to what's going on. I think this person was saying, well, actually, I feel a bit unloved. I feel a bit on my own here, and actually, I need more of a sense of sort of togetherness. And in a way, we are a little embarrassed by the phrase parish needs-based. It is slightly dull. But actually, in a way, it's kind of saying, how can we have more of that sense of actually coming alongside and really being more systematic about the approach, rather than what has been the tendency, which has been to jump when someone shouted, but actually to let other parishes where perhaps the clergy person or others are not sort of saying, I need some help here, just sort of carry on. And there is a mutual accountability in that as well. Paul's right. It is a kind of sense of holding each other to account. Not anyone from the top saying this is how you must do your parish mission. Every parish has to develop its own. But actually, but having that slightly more programmed approach. So I think that's the new thing here. The other quite new thing, and I think we still have a lot of work to do on this. But what does one people plan mean? It's sort of, is it just jargon? I think that is mainly coming from clergy. And again, I know I felt this when I was a parish clergy person. Sort of feeling of, am I being developed? In what sense am I being developed? Am I being encouraged to lead in a slightly different way from how I was last year? And anything that we can do to help just think through how do clergy and lay people and those who work in church house, how do they sort of come on board? How do we induct them, you know, well into their roles, help them in those early stages? At the moment, it's very patchy. At that deanery residential again, there were 3 clergy there who just come into post. And one said, it was brilliant. I was offered this fantastic mentor when I came to post. I'm a first-time incumbent. This mentor's just down the road. It's been brilliant. And the other 2 looked at this person and said, we weren't offered a mentor. And you suddenly realise this is incredibly patchy at the moment. And so just saying, actually, we need to be more consistent here. We need to be clearer about what we're offering. And that, I think, is both the task of the new director of mission, you know, and shaping within an archdeacons, you know, and bishops, really thinking those things through with clergy and with those on the ground, but also bringing in some of the expertise that we do have, particularly with Linda, our HR director, who does come from comes with a very strong Christian vocation and calling, but comes from a different world, more outside of the church, and actually has begun to ask some quite sharp questions and helpful questions to us to think, actually, what could we learn from that as well? Because, you know, the church is not the repository of all good practice in the way that we treat people or the way that we develop people. So I suppose it's kind of, there is some untried stuff here, and there's some stuff which definitely we have learned from others. And I think every diocese at the moment, you know, in general, we have to remember we are at a place still where the church is just gently declining year by year in the Guildford diocese and in almost every diocese in the country. And we're all having to ask questions, in some parts of the country, a whole lot sharper questions about, you know, how do we do this thing moving forward? And I think those are the kind of questions that are prompting and have prompted the review as well. Good. Plenty more questions. Some at the front here, Paul, if you don't mind coming down the hill.
I will.
Oh, just a second.
That's you.
Thank you. I was, some years ago, very encouraged and excited when something at Diocesan House, some organisation, was called Communities Engagement Team. What I'm hearing tonight, has been very little, if any, mention about communities. We've used the word mission team. We've used the word mission enablers. But what actually does that mean? When you're hearing about how this review was set up, I didn't hear any comment about you consulting with anybody outside the church. And how are we perceived by others who also have, might we say, certainly concern that we would say pastoral about people in our area? How are we perceived by the many, many voluntary organisations, many of whom involve Christians? I had one bishop in Kent once said that 75% of volunteers in voluntary organisations are Christian. How are we envisaging kind of using our responsibility in an incarnational way to be working with, or are we wanting to be in our bubble as churches, as the diocese? And if we go down that route, how missional are we? And I think in linking with...
Yes, thank you. That's a really important point.
But can I say that, linking it up with what you've said about cutting out church chaplains, I'm aware that this particular school, for example, is placed in the ward of one of the most disadvantaged wards in Surrey. Therefore, the link with families, children in need is huge, and that working with the church, with the school relational workers, has been a very important part in supporting kind of work that goes on in this community where a lot of the children come from.
Thank you. I think we hear the point.
Right, okay.
If I could just respond to that. What this review is not doing is saying we're knocking community engagement out the water at all. What it's recognising is that most community engagement starts in parishes. Not all does, but most starts in parishes. And actually, parishes need to be encouraged. There's so many every parish represented here is engaged in communities in different ways. If you're not reaching out to elderly, if you're not reaching out to young people, if no one is helping with the food bank, if no one's getting involved with street passes, and none of that's happening, then the church isn't doing its stuff. And I think we know that. And certainly among the mission enablers, this is a first, but will be someone who has a particular focus on helping churches connect with their communities in that kind of way. There's been another strand of what we've done as a diocese historically, and there are parts of this which are brilliant, and there are parts of this that are quite problematic. And that is to develop partnerships with borough councils, with the Surrey County Council, to develop services, to work in partnership with them. And that, in many ways, is a real strength to us. The problem about it has been that often it's been done over the heads of the parish clergy who actually, and lay people who are working in those communities. And I think when I first arrived, I heard quite a number of stories from around the place. We suddenly discovered there was someone working in communities in our parish. We didn't even know they existed, and they're employed by the diocese. This was sort of message that was coming across, and sometimes cutting across what the church was trying to do. So what we're really seeking to do here is not to say we blow all that out of the water at all. We recognise that there is real value in some of that work, not least because it actually keeps us in touch with civic, with those involved at higher levels in those kind of areas. But we do need to have that more integrated with what parishes are doing. That's actually incredibly important. So, for example, there are 3 people employed by the diocese, paid for from outside, called Families Matters workers, and they work in 3 of the poorest areas of the diocese. Actually, there were 4, but there are 3 now. They're paid for outside. Now, actually, where those Family Matters workers have been encouraged to work alongside the parish clergy in those areas and the key lay people in those areas, actually, of course, is win-win. Kind of works in every sort of way. The church is enabled to reach out into the community. The community worker has plentiful volunteers that they can draw on, and it works very well. But the way it was set up initially was that quite a number of these sort of roles were taken on. Local people weren't consulted at all. The local churches weren't consulted at all. And it's as though sort of 2 different strands of activity were going on. And actually, with this new approach, there's the possibility of a 4th Families Matter worker actually very engaged with the community in this ward and precisely in this area. So I think it's certainly not stepping back from communities engagement at all. We still have much the biggest communities engagement team of any diocese in the Church of England. And this is in a diocese which has the least deprivation of any diocese in the Church of England. So you can't say we're not committed to that area, but you can say that we're just thinking about how we do it better, because it hasn't always been done quite as carefully as it could have been. I hope that's a bit of an answer, but it's certainly not saying we're pulling away from that, and we retain quite a major resource there. Paul.
And just one other thing, I recognise that there's been so much information this evening that it would be really difficult for everybody to take everything in. But just to reiterate, in the needs-based process, our own recognition that I think, there is a danger in some of the church plans that we've seen, that there's an element of, God so loved not the world but the church, and that's why within the listening framework that we're wanting to encourage parishes to embrace. There's a deliberate question which asks, what is God saying to you through the school and through the local community and world? So that's an important thing that's built into.
Probably got time for a couple more questions, and then we just got one little thing to do before we wind up with prayer.
I've made it.
Well done.
Very briefly, on the chaplaincy issue, I was part of the team that turned round the school 20 years ago. And I won't dwell on the fact that the chaplain here made a huge contribution to a community that is very deprived. But before that, I was a trustee of the Kingham Hill Trust and the chaplain at Kingham Hill School, again for children coming from deprived areas made a huge contribution. I moved on to participating with the formation of schools in the current trend, academies.
Okay.
And the Christian academies nearly all have chaplains. And
Okay, so you're asking the question whether we need to have more chaplains?
No, I'm really saying that from a growth perspective, if the church is going to grow, and my own feeling is the church should grow from the bottom end of the spectrum and not the top, bearing in mind that this diocese doesn't have very many secondary schools. If there were opportunities to add to the secondary school portfolio, it would be great to do that.
Yes.
But in those cases, I would hope that the policy you're advocating would be such that it could be flexible.
Thank you very much. I think that's a solid point. I think the question with chaplains is not a question of whether we need chaplains, because I think chaplains in schools are fantastic, but the question is how we resource chaplains. You know, if we were to say we need chaplains in, you know, a good chunk of our schools around the place, and they're going to be resourced out of parish share, then that's okay, but you need to recognise we'll need a 10% rise on parish share to pay for that. I think the question is where things financed from is really quite an important question. And I think, for example, local churches, you know, the churches in this area might think, well, we're going to put a bit of our mission funding, as has happened in Woking, for example, in having a chaplain working in one of our areas, one of the schools and so on. Or indeed an individual well-resourced parish might think, we're going to put resource in there. Or might think, well, we're going to put resource in a series of volunteer chaplains who are going to be properly managed and so on, which is working well in other settings. So it's sort of, I think you need to recognise, if we're talking about Church House Guildford must be, you know, we must be, the diocese must be funding these sort of posts. That is, we are the diocese that is most dependent on parish share. We amazingly don't have any, we have very, very little by way of historic resources, fewer than any other, I think fewer than any other diocese in the country. So actually, so 96% of the money we spend on stipends, on housing, on the central services. Of course, we also give a big chunk of money, a 7-figure sum, to Church House Westminster in order to support ministry in other poorer parts of the country, which I think is a really good thing, but it is an important thing to remember as well. But anything else that we say we want to do as a diocese comes out of parish share. There's nowhere else for it to come. And that's why I think local initiatives are actually so much more effective often, where there's locally owned vision, where people respond to locally owned vision. People don't often say, we'd love to pay more parish share. I've not actually heard many people say that. I have heard people say, we'd love to employ a youth worker. And you suddenly find that people who are able to, who are used to giving a £5 in the collection and thinking that's generous, actually, you know, find they can give £5,000 into the collection, and actually their lifestyle isn't altered very much. Because they get excited about the idea of taking on a youth worker or a chaplain or whatever it is. So I think locally is often the place where vision really flourishes and where finance then comes in. And the idea that we sort of take more and more people on in the centre, I think is a mistake, just because it's quite hard to convey that sense of excitement about, we think you need to be paying more parish share. It just doesn't go down well as a message, I've discovered, after 10 years of bishoping. Great.
Very simple
Last
question.
I think this way needs to be. Yeah.
Can I ask about the bottom line? I assume that as a result of this this review, parish share doesn't need to go up.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether there's a dividend from this process that could be returned to parishes, that could be used for all this funding of chaplaincy and these other priorities that everybody has mentioned?
I think that's a really good question. I think I might hand on to Peter here. That's a very good last question. I mean, the answer is there is. It's not massive, but the answer is there is. But Peter, over to you.
The answer is that we said that there is about a 3 full-time equivalent reduction. And that actually equates to just around about £100,000. And if you were to relate that to parish share, that would reflect around about 1% on parish share, which is relatively small. And bearing in mind that actually this will take a little time to implement, inevitably, by the time it's implemented, whilst that will feed through, it probably will get swallowed up by inflation over that time. But it will genuinely feed through. But it is small. I think the thing to remember is that slide that Bishop Andrew showed previously about the proportion of services and where the kind of balance spend sits. We actually spend about 2.7 million on those central resources, what we've been talking about this evening, and about 2.1 of that comes from parish share. And as Bishop Andrew pointed out, 72% of those services that we provide from parish share, around about 1.5 million of that 2.1 million, is actually related to services that sit really in that sort of statutory bucket, those roles and functions and services that we require both as a diocese and also under charity law operating at the scale that we're operating. So the really important question, once you've dealt with whether the discretionary services are right or not and whether we need those, actually the really important question is whether the size and scale of what we're providing from that 72% is actually right, whether that's efficient, effective, and good value for money. And we try constantly, I can assure you, we really do try very, very hard to ensure the money that we spend at Church House is spent well. We recognise that every penny of that comes from faithful people in pews giving to the mission and ministry, in their minds, very much the mission and ministry of their parish. And so we're very conscious of that. We have, however, done, as part of the review, we've rerun some benchmarking work that we did 2 years ago in 2016. We did in enormous detail with Portsmouth and Winchester Diocese. We were able to get right down so that we could level the figures and really understand that we were comparing like with like, and not just roles that were called the same, but things that did the same things, same types of activities. We've rerun that, and we've done it against the new organisation of Church House as it will be compared to how Portsmouth and Winchester are today. And this slide summarises what the differences are. And there are some differences that existed before that carry on existing. One difference is that we pay our clergy through their stipends. Their stipends are about 3.5% higher than any other diocese in the country. That's not a bad thing. It's actually historic as to why it's like that in this diocese. It's good that we respect and honour our clergy in that way. I suspect it probably doesn't make much difference to them, but actually it's just a matter of fact that whenever you do any benchmarking, that always comes out. Secondly, the thing that always comes out is that we are perceived as a wealthy diocese, and therefore our contribution to the national church, we're very much a net contributor. So much like parish share, we as a diocese actually support other dioceses through the national church that levy through votes 1 to 5 for our payments. And we're a net contributor, and we pay more than Winchester and Portsmouth relatively to the national church. The other area that is higher than those two other dioceses that we've already touched on this evening is our communities team under this new model. We have reduced the amount of parish share funding into the communities team as we've gone from where we are today to where we are in the future. We're working very hard with other parties to look at the way in which we can optimise the grant funding, and there are good conversations going on around that. So it's not really about cutting back what we're doing, it's about shifting the balance. But our communities team will still be a larger investment out of parish share than those other two dioceses. The areas where there are differences, in Portsmouth, their senior leadership costs are higher than our senior leadership costs. So, and there's reasons for that. They have a full-time diocesan secretary. They're a smaller diocese, so relatively their cost is going to be higher. Similarly, they have a full-time DDO. They're a smaller diocese, which tends to lead into their ordinand and vocation costs being greater than the other two dioceses in this comparison. And also their housing costs are higher as they own and maintain their curate's housing, and they charge that back through their parish share. And therefore, when you look at a comparison, there's a difference there. In Winchester, their safeguarding team is larger than we are proposing. That's got a lot to do, we think, with the fact that they have more historic safeguarding cases to deal with than we have. Similarly, they have another area of their budget that's greater. They also pay for their curate's housing, charge that through parish share. They pay for their quinquennials on churches. The costs of those are funded through their parish share, so it becomes part of their central, if you like, church house costs, whereas parishes pay those locally in this diocese and also in Portsmouth. Other than that, when we did this detailed work, actually what it showed was even though those dioceses are going through change, like many other dioceses around the country, pretty well everything else was pretty well equal. It showed that actually there weren't any major distortions. We weren't spending significantly more or significantly less than relatively than those other dioceses. So I hope that helps in part answer the question that was asked.
Thank you very much. We are the diocese, surprisingly, where parishes, may not feel like this in your parish, but where parishes pay a smaller amount of that income into parish share than any other diocese in the country. That's not because we're incredibly much cheaper as a central team than others, but it is an interesting fact that, of course, when we talk about the money that comes in through parish share, I mean, the large majority of that then goes out in supporting, paying for clergy, for stipends and housing and pensions. Some goes to the national church, as we've heard, to support ministry in other parts of the country, and I think we should be proud of that. I think that's absolutely right and proper. I mean, I came here from being Bishop of Aston in Birmingham, and the number of deprived communities in Birmingham, they just couldn't have any level of parish ministry in large numbers, large swathes of Birmingham, if it wasn't from the kind of support that we have here. And I think that's sort of, both locally in terms of wealthier areas supporting poorer areas within the diocese, and also a wealthier diocese supporting poorer dioceses around the country, I think is something we should be proud of in the Church of England. The nonconformists don't do it really much, which is why you don't get, nonconformist churches on housing estates very much. They have to be self-supporting. And actually, I think our model, while we still believe in the parish model, that actually it's important that there is a church somewhere there which is properly managed and so on across the country, we do need to recognise that sharing of resources is going to be extraordinarily important. So I think, it's very easy just to think, parish share, it's a tax. Actually, I'd even like to put a word in for tax. I mean, imagine a society where there's no proper taxation system. Well, we know some of them, and they're nightmarish. The poor just go to the wall in those places. I sometimes think, we need to remind ourselves God loves a cheerful tax giver. We might not even, always approve of every way, but it's very easy just to sort of think, I don't want to pay that, or this is too expensive, or whatever. But actually, do we want to, a civilized society. Some of our money might not go in exactly the ways we want it to go, or don't we? And do we want a church which remains a national church and which remains in the diocese a church which can hang on in there in the poorer parts of the diocese, or don't we? So I think there are some sort of bigger questions here which I get quite excited about, really. I can make a big plug for paying our taxes and paying parish share and all the rest, because actually when you really think about how is this being used, and then of course the question is accountability, and I do think that this new approach will actually bring a much greater level of accountability, so you know what you're paying for, and we're making sure that if we've got roles which really are just not coming up at all from the parishes, then actually we say, well, they might be brilliant people, they might have a lovely passion for whatever area it is, but actually we don't need that role. And I think it gives us much greater ability to do that. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We're going to close with some prayer led by the future Archdeacon of Cornwall. We are, as well as seeking to appoint a new director of mission, we're also seeking to appoint a new Archdeacon of Dorking and also a new diocesan director of ordinance, because William is about to retire after long and distinguished service in the diocese. So do pray as well. We really value your prayers for these senior roles. These are very, very important roles, particularly at a time of significant change.